They told us the Quorum outlawed paint because it damaged the substrate. The exterior walls of Sector 9 were a regulated alloy, thermal-resistant, load-bearing, and very precisely calibrated, and apparently a thin layer of pigment caused microfractures in the surface tension that their environmental sensors couldn't ignore. That was the official language. Substrate integrity. Thermal coefficient disruption. They issued the order on a Tuesday, and by Wednesday evening, the Compliance Bureau had sealed every supply depot that stocked pigment, solvent, or binding medium within the colony perimeter. I was 22 years old. I had 3 cans of spray medium hidden under a loose panel in the floor of my bunk, and I thought I understood what resistance meant. I didn't not yet, but I was learning. My name is Theo Vasek. I was born in Sector 9, which means I was born into the occupation, which means I never knew anything else. My mother had worked the water reclamation shift before the Quorum shut down the independent labor contracts, and my father had been a graffiti artist in the old sense, the beautiful, noisy, chaotic old sense, when the colony walls were covered in color and argument and rage and love and sheer human noise. He died in the 3rd year of the occupation. Not executed, not disappeared, though that happened to plenty. He just stopped eating. He sat down in our quarters one evening, set his brushes on the table where my brother Lawrence and I could see them, and over the following 6 weeks he simply faded. The Quorum didn't do it. They just made the world so gray that a man like him had no reason to stay in it. I kept the brushes. You need to understand what the Quorum was before you can understand why what happened in Sector 9 mattered. I've heard people on other stations describe them as conquerors, as occupiers, as overlords, and all of those words are technically accurate, but they miss something essential. The Quorum weren't cruel in the way humans are cruel. They weren't sadistic. There was no hatred in them, no pleasure in our suffering, no contempt for our smallness. They were administrators. They had arrived at our colony 17 years before my story begins, had assessed our infrastructure, our resource output, our biological yield, and had simply reorganized us the way you reorganize a filing system. We were inefficient. They made us efficient. They weren't wrong by their own metrics. What they didn't measure, what they couldn't measure because it registered to their sensors as noise, as interference, as substrate damage, was the fact that human beings need to make marks. We need to say, I was here. We need to color the walls of the world we live in and argue with each other and make things that have no productive function whatsoever. We need to do it the way we need oxygen, not as luxury, as biology. The Quorum looked at a wall covered in paint, and their instruments registered molecular instability. They couldn't see what it was. They had no analog for it. That was their mistake, and in 17 years it killed them. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The night I met Elia, I was on the south exterior of the thermal processing station, the one the colony workers still called the furnace even though the Quorum had redesignated it Production Node 7. It was 2 hours past curfew. The colony was dark and still in that particular way it got at night, not peaceful, never peaceful, but suspended, like held breath. The Quorum's patrol units moved on silent magnetic runners, and their sensor packages could detect thermal signatures, motion variance, and sound above 40 decibels. I had learned over 2 years of working at night how to move inside their detection gaps. You went slow. You went quiet. You kept your body temperature from spiking by staying calm, which was the hardest part, because calm was the thing you had the least of when you were pressing your back against a wall in the dark, with 3 cans of medium in a sling bag, and the sound of a patrol runner somewhere in the middle distance. I'd been marking that wall for 40 minutes. The image I was building was a man's face, my father's face, though nobody who saw it would know that, constructed from angular lines that the medium threw in bands of orange and deep red against the gray alloy. It was the color that mattered. The image mattered, but the color was the argument. It was the thing the wall was not supposed to have. I heard her before I saw her. A sound, a hiss, then silence, then the soft percussion of medium-hitting wall coming from around the corner of the station, the east face, the exposed side where the patrol sightlines were cleaner and the risk was worse. My first instinct was to freeze and listen. My second instinct, 15 seconds later, was to pack up and run. My third instinct, which won because I was 22 and therefore not yet fully rational about self-preservation, was to go look. She was working fast, faster than me. She had a style I'd never seen in person, broad strokes that connected into something geometric and then suddenly curved, the lines flowing into a shape that my eye kept trying to resolve and kept failing to because she was still building it. She was entirely focused, crouched slightly, her left hand tracking ahead of the can to feel the wall's temperature, the way you learn to do when you've been at it long enough to know that cold walls absorb differently than warm ones. I said nothing, I watched. After a moment she said, without turning around, "You're going to get us both caught if you keep breathing like that." I said I wasn't breathing loud. She said, "You're breathing scared. Scared is loud to anyone paying attention." Her name was Elia. I didn't learn it that night. That night she finished her image, which turned out to be a bird, a real one, the kind that hadn't existed on the colony surface for 8 years because the Quorum's atmospheric regulators had pushed the ambient oxygen mix slightly outside the range of avian respiratory tolerance, and which existed now only in the memory of anyone old enough to remember them. And then she was gone. She moved along the wall and around the corner and into the dark at a pace that looked unhurried but covered ground quickly, and I stood there looking at the bird for a moment before I picked up my bag and went the other direction. I thought about the bird for 3 days. My brother Lawrence worked in the Compliance Bureau. I want to be honest about this rather than soft about it, because Lawrence deserves honesty even now. He wasn't a collaborator in the cheap sense, wasn't someone who turned people in for personal advantage or who took pleasure in enforcement. He was practical. He was 10 years older than me, and he remembered the years before the occupation, which I didn't, and those years had taught him something I was still too young to have learned. That survival is its own form of resistance, and that a man who keeps his position and his access and his clearances is sometimes more useful than a man who makes a beautiful mark on a wall and then disappears into a detention cell. He wasn't wrong. I wasn't wrong. We were both right in the way that means neither of us could fully reach the other. He knew I was marking. He never said so. He would come by our quarters on his evenings off and eat with me and talk about the Bureau's logistics, carefully, in the way of a man who is giving information without appearing to give it, and I understood from these conversations which patrol sectors had been upgraded, which detention centers were at capacity, which sections of the colony were under heightened sensor watch. He fed me what I needed to stay alive. He never asked me to stop. I loved my brother. He understood me better than I knew. It took me 2 weeks to find Ilya again. I found her the way you find anyone in Sector 9 who doesn't want to be found officially, through the network of people who pass notes, who nod at particular times, who leave particular marks at particular locations that mean things to those who know how to read them. There were maybe 40 people in the colony who still worked at night, still marked the walls. We didn't have a name for ourselves. We didn't organize in any formal sense because organization left evidence and evidence left bodies. But we knew each other, in the way water in a system knows the other water, by pressure and current, and the path of least resistance. Her name was Elia, and she had come to Sector 9 from one of the outer habitat rings 8 months before I met her, transferred under the labor redistribution order that the Quorum had issued after the eastern agricultural blocks went to automated harvest. She had no family in the sector. She had a bunk in the workers' dormitory on level 4, and a work assignment in the filtration maintenance crew, and a sling bag she kept under her mattress with 17 cans of medium in various stages of depletion. The first time we worked the same wall together, neither of us spoke much. We had a particular method. I'd sketch the underlying geometry, the bones of the image, in a neutral tone that could read as weathering from a distance. She'd come in behind me and lay the color, the real color, the argument, the thing that made the wall say something. We divided the labor not because we discussed it, but because it was obvious after the first night that this was how our styles fit together. She made things alive. I made them structurally sound. Between the two of us, we made work that held together and burned. There was a wall on the south corridor of the residential block, a long, unbroken stretch of gray alloy that faced east and caught the first light of the colony's artificial morning cycle. We worked on it over 11 nights. What we made was not a single image, but a sequence, a story told in color and shape and line across 40 meters of wall. It began at the left end with something barely there, a curve, a suggestion of motion, a color so close to the alloy's natural tone that you had to stand within 2 meters and look directly at it to see it. Then it grew. As you moved right, it became richer, denser, louder in color. By the center, it was undeniable. By the right end, it was the loudest thing in Sector 9. I asked Elia one night, while we were working, what it was supposed to mean. She said, "It's supposed to mean we were here." I said that was what all of it meant. She didn't disagree with me, she just said, "Say it louder then." The quorum noticed on the 4th day after we finished. I know this because Aaron, an older man, former colony engineer, one of the first people who had ever taught me to read the behavioral patterns of patrol units, came to find me the following morning and told me he had seen a quorum assessment team at the residential block wall at dawn. 3 of them with handheld instruments scanning the surface. He said they'd spent 40 minutes on it. He said their instruments had run 3 complete cycles, which was unusual. The standard scan was 1 cycle, 2 if there was something anomalous. He said they looked confused. That word stopped me. Aaron used precise language. He didn't say confused casually. I asked him what he meant by it. He said, their body language, the way they held their instruments, the way they kept rescanning. I've watched them work for 12 years and I've never seen them run a 3rd cycle on anything. They always know what they're looking at. Last night they didn't. I didn't fully understand what this meant then. I thought it meant we'd made something technically impressive, something their instruments couldn't categorize cleanly. I was right about that. I was wrong about what it implied. 3 days later, Elia was arrested. She was taken on her way back from a marking run, not the residential block, a different location, one of the transit corridor walls near the outer ring. A patrol unit intercepted her at the transit junction. She had medium residue on her hands and a half-depleted can in her bag, and the patrol unit logged her as a surface integrity violator and transferred her to the Bureau's holding facility on Level 2 within 20 minutes of the intercept. I found out from Lawrence. He came to my quarters that night, which he never did without arranging it in advance, and he sat down and looked at me for a long moment before he said her name. I asked him what happened to surface integrity violators. He told me, detention, processing. The Bureau's standard procedure was a 3-day assessment followed by labor reassignment to the outer maintenance sectors, which were technically still inside the colony's safety protocols and technically still habitable. Technically. The reality was that the outer maintenance sectors had atmospheric integrity issues that the Quorum hadn't prioritized for repair, and that people reassigned there had an average tenure of about 8 months before they appeared in the Bureau's medical logs with respiratory compromise. Lawrence told me this the way a man tells you something he doesn't want to tell you because he thinks you need to know it. He held my eyes while he said it. He was giving me something. I asked him where the holding facility intake processed new arrivals. He told me. Then he told me about the patrol rotation on Level 2. Then he told me about the one section of corridor between the transit junction and the holding facility that was outside camera coverage, because the mounting bracket on sensor station 12 had been misaligned in the last maintenance cycle, and nobody had corrected it yet. Then he stood up, put his hand on my shoulder briefly, and left. I sat alone for 2 hours. The thing I felt wasn't courage. I want to be clear about this because I've heard the story told as if I was brave, and the honest account is that I was scared enough that my hands wouldn't stop moving. I kept picking up objects and setting them down. I drank 2 cups of the filtered water that tasted of recycled heat and mineral correction, and I sat in my bunk with my father's brushes on the table in front of me and thought about what I was going to do. I packed the brushes. I didn't know why at the time. They were useless for what I was planning, but I packed them. What I planned was simple and bad. Simple plans are usually bad. You go in. You get her. You get out. 3 stages. Each stage assumes the previous one worked. None of them accounted for the 12 things that could go wrong between the transit junction and the holding facility, or the 17 things that could go wrong inside the facility itself, or the particular and very specific thing that did go wrong, which was that the misaligned sensor on Station 12 had been corrected that afternoon. I was intercepted in the corridor, outside the facility intake. The Quorum's enforcement units were not violent in the way human guards are violent. They didn't strike, didn't shout, didn't handle you with the particular rough contempt that humans in that position often use to establish hierarchy. They moved with complete efficiency and zero affect. 1 unit blocked the corridor in front of me. 1 unit sealed the corridor behind me. A 3rd unit approached and extended what I can only describe as an assessment appendage. A structured sensor array that ran a thermal and chemical scan of my person in about 4 seconds. When it registered the medium residue on my hands and the brushes in my pack, the unit produced a processing tag and attached it to my collar, and I was walked to the facility intake without a word spoken in either direction. The holding cells were designed to be functional and nothing else. The walls were bare alloy, smooth and clean and utterly gray. The ceiling emitted a steady ambient light that had no warmth to it. The temperature was precisely regulated. There was a shelf for sitting and lying. There was a waste reclamation unit. There was nothing on any surface, nothing drawn, nothing scratched, not even the unconscious marks that humans leave when they've been in a space long enough to need to touch it. I understood what this meant. The cells weren't designed to punish. They were designed to erase. I was in the cell for 6 hours before the door opened, and Elia was pushed in. She had a bruise on her left cheekbone, not from the Quorum, who didn't strike, but from the fall when she'd been intercepted and had reflexively bolted and been tripped by a unit's leg restraint. She looked at me for a moment. Then she sat down on the shelf. "You came to get me out," she said. I said yes. "And now you're in here." I said that was correct. She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "Did you at least bring something to draw with?" I had the brushes in my pack. No medium, no pigment, nothing to work with. Brushes were useless. I took them out anyway and set them on the shelf between us. She looked at them for a long time. "Your father's," she said. I didn't know how she knew. I asked her how she knew. She said, "The way you packed them. You don't pack tools the way you packed those. You were carrying them like they were something else." I told her about my father. I hadn't planned to, but there was nothing else to do in a cell with smooth walls and ambient light and no way out, and talking kept the silence from becoming something you had to fight. I told her about him the way I hadn't told anyone since Lawrence, and Lawrence already knew it all. I told her about the evening he sat down and put the brushes on the table, about the 6 weeks, about what it means when a man's particular light simply goes out, because the world removed the thing that kept it burning. When I finished, she sat with it for a while. Then she said, "Do you understand what they're afraid of?" I said the Quorum weren't afraid. I said that was the whole problem. They weren't capable of being afraid of us because they didn't register us as a genuine threat. We were an administrative problem. She shook her head. "They ran 3 cycles on the residential wall," she said. "Aaron told you about that." I said yes. 3 cycles because their instruments couldn't categorize it, couldn't file it. A Quorum instrument that can't file something is an instrument that has encountered something outside the parameters of the Quorum's understanding of what a thing can be. She paused. "They aren't afraid of us making marks. They're afraid of what the marks mean. Not the images, the act, the fact that we do it for no productive reason, the fact that we keep doing it when they tell us to stop, the fact that it means something to us that they cannot measure. I looked at the brushes on the shelf between us. I thought about what she was saying. They've been administering us for 17 years, she said. They've mapped everything about us except the one thing they can't map, and they know it's there. That's what the third scan cycle was. They know there's something in us they don't understand, and they know it's connected to the marks. They're not confused about the marks. They're confused about the hunger. I said, understanding that doesn't get us out of this cell. She said, no, but it's the only thing that will eventually get us out of the whole situation, so I think it's worth knowing. I thought about Lawrence. I thought about what he had given me, the way he'd handed me the information about the sensor bracket without saying, here is how you get her out, just the information, the trust that I would know what to do with it. I thought about Aaron and his 40-year-old memory of birds. I thought about the residential block wall and the way the color had grown louder as you moved from left to right. I asked Elia, how many people in Sector 9 are still working? She said, 40 that I know of, probably more. If we got word out, I said, if every one of them on the same night hit a different wall, not one or two locations, every major surface in the sector, all at once. She looked at me. Their assessment teams would have to run triage, I said. 40 locations, more. They'd have to prioritize. They'd have to decide which surfaces represented the highest regulatory risk, which violations to process first. And while they're triaging, they can't be everywhere, she said. And if the work is loud enough, if it's not just marks, if it's something their instruments have to stop and run 3 cycles on, then the triage takes longer. And while they're running their cycles, we move, she said. It wasn't a plan. It was the skeleton of a plan. The plan would require that someone on the outside receive the idea, organize 40 people who didn't organize, convince them to act simultaneously on a night we would designate from inside a detention cell using no communication technology whatsoever. Lawrence, it required Lawrence. The Quorum's processing procedure included a formal notification to the detainees' registered contacts, an administrative function that had a specific protocol, a specific form, a specific moment in the intake process where the Bureau's liaison made contact with whoever was listed on the detainee's colony registration as next of kin or designated contact. For me, that was Lawrence. The notification was sent within 12 hours of intake. It was a standard form. It said nothing except that I was being held and would undergo assessment. But the form had a field for additional notes. And Lawrence worked in the Bureau. And Lawrence was meticulous with paperwork. I don't know what he wrote in that field. I never asked him, and he never told me. What I know is that 41 people went out 4 nights later, on the night that Elia and I were scheduled for assessment, and what they put on the walls of Sector 9's major surfaces, the residential blocks, the transit corridors, the outer ring junction walls, the thermal processing station exterior, the main administrative approach, was not individual marks, not separate images, but a single coordinated work that ran across every surface in the sector and told the same story from 41 different starting points. The story was simple. It was the thing we'd always been trying to say. We were here, we are here. You cannot make us stop being here. The Quorum deployed 17 assessment teams within the first 90 minutes. We could hear the alert frequencies through the cell wall, a low harmonic that their units emitted when transitioning to elevated response protocol. We heard it shift and intensify and then spread, the way a frequency spreads through a resonant structure until the whole building was humming with it. Elia stood up. She went to the cell wall, the interior wall, the alloy surface, smooth and gray and regulation clean, and she put her hand flat against it. We don't have anything, I said. She reached into her collar and pulled out a thin tube I hadn't known was there. It was a single-use applicator, the kind you used for fine detailing, barely any medium in it, maybe enough for a few minutes of work. She'd had it hidden in the seam of her collar since the intake. She looked at me, she said, "It's not about the pigment." She drew on the wall. I don't know how to describe what she drew except to say that it was the bird, the same bird from the east face of the thermal processing station, the one that no longer existed in the colony's atmosphere, the one that lived only in the memory of people who were old enough to remember them. She drew it in the one color she had, which was a pale gray-green, barely distinct from the wall itself. You had to know it was there to see it. When the medium ran out, she set the tube on the shelf and looked at what she'd made. Then she picked up one of my father's brushes. She pressed the dry bristles against the wall near the bird. She held it there for a moment. Then she moved it, leaving no mark at all, tracing the outline of something that wasn't there. I watched her. After a moment, I picked up the other brush. I don't know how long we worked. There was nothing to work with. The brushes left no mark. But we moved them against the wall in the particular focused way you move when you're working on something real, when the image is taking shape, when you're building something that matters, and the act itself, the gesture, the intent, the refusal to sit down and be still and let the smooth gray wall win was the thing. It was the argument. It was what Elia had been trying to tell me, and what I hadn't fully understood until I was doing it in a detention cell with a dry brush on a gray wall in the dark. The assessment teams took 6 hours, 41 surfaces. They ran multiple cycles on several of them. Aaron told me later that the residential block wall alone got 7, which was unprecedented in the Bureau's operational history. 7 cycles. They ran 7 cycles on a wall and still couldn't file it. When they finally got to processing the detainees, the senior assessment officer, a quorum administrator that the colony workers called Freddie, because he appeared so often in administrative proceedings that people had started naming him the way you name a piece of recurring weather, entered the review of our cases and found the paperwork anomalous, not irregular in a way that triggered a disciplinary flag. Anomalous in the quorum's particular way, which meant outside parameters, cannot categorize, cannot file. The anomaly was this. The additional notes field on my intake notification, which Lawrence had filled in using the Bureau's standard procedural language, contained language that the quorum's administrative system processed as a standard request for case review, but which, when run through the Bureau's own cross-reference protocols that Lawrence had helped design, and therefore knew better than anyone, generated a holding pattern. A loop in the processing sequence that kept the case in pending status indefinitely, while the system waited for a condition that could never be satisfied because Lawrence had written it in a way that made the condition logically unresolvable. He had locked our cases in bureaucratic amber, using the quorum's own system, with the quorum's own language. While the system ran in circles, and the assessment teams ran their 7th cycle on the residential wall, a maintenance crew with legitimate work orders. Legitimate because Lawrence had generated them, using his bureau clearance. 2 days before, arrived at the holding facility to service the ventilation array on level 2. The crew chief was Aaron. The rest of the crew were people I recognized by face from 2 years of working dark walls in the middle of the night. They didn't break anything. They didn't fight anyone. They fixed the ventilation array, which genuinely needed fixing, and in the course of doing so, they moved through sections of the facility that their work order legitimately required them to access. And in the course of that movement, a cell door was unlocked using a maintenance override code that Lawrence had obtained through proper bureau channels for the facility's most recent safety compliance review. And Elia and I walked out of a detention cell and into a maintenance corridor, and from there into the outer ring of Sector 9, while 17 quorum assessment teams ran in circles between 41 walls they couldn't file. I don't want you to think it was clean. It wasn't clean. There was a patrol unit in the corridor that hadn't been in the rotation Lawrence had mapped, and Aaron walked into it and took a restraint tag to his wrist before two of the others pulled him clear. And we ran the last 100 meters at a pace that didn't allow for calm, and I had my father's brushes slamming against my back the entire way, and I couldn't have told you why I hadn't left them in the cell except that they were my father's, and I was not going to leave them in that smooth gray place. We came out into the outer ring in the gray pre-dawn, when the artificial morning cycle was just beginning to warm the light from cold white towards something that was trying to approximate gold. Elia stopped and looked at the wall of the outer ring junction, one of the 41 surfaces, one of the ones that had gone up 4 nights before. The image was still there. The Quorum hadn't covered it yet. Their assessment teams had been too busy scanning and rescanning to get to remediation. The colony was still. The light was coming up. The image on the wall was loud. She looked at it for a long moment, then she looked at me. I said, "They'll cover it." She said, "Yes." I said, "And then we'll go again." She looked at the brushes in my pack, the handles just visible above the top edge. She looked at me. "Yes," she said, "we will." I want to tell you that what happened next was dramatic, that the Quorum mounted a massive response, that there was a confrontation, that it was resolved in a single decisive moment with a clear ending. But that isn't how it worked. That isn't how human resistance ever really works in my experience. It works the way water works, slowly, persistently, getting into every crack, freezing and expanding, coming back after every attempt to seal it out. The Quorum covered the 41 surfaces within 2 weeks. We went again in the 3rd week. 12 surfaces that time, more organized, more deliberate. They covered those. We went again. 6 weeks after Elia and I walked out of the holding facility, there wasn't a major wall in Sector 9 that hadn't been marked at least once, and several of them had been marked and covered and marked again. The assessment teams were running continuous cycles. Their instruments were generating anomalous reading across half the colony's substrate surface. Lawrence told me carefully, over a meal in my quarters, that the Bureau's administrative processing system had been generating holding patterns in 14% of its active cases, because the anomaly he'd introduced had propagated through the cross-reference protocol in ways he hadn't entirely intended. The Quorum's administrative staff had been running diagnostics for 3 weeks and hadn't found the source yet. He said this while looking at his food and not at me, and he said it in the tone he used when he was conveying information without conveying information, and I understood him. He was winning his version of the same war. The moment I think of when I remember all of it, the moment that stays, that I find myself coming back to in the way you come back to something that has the quality of truth in it, didn't happen on a wall. It happened in Freddie's office. They brought me in for a formal assessment 3 months after the detention release. The holding pattern in my case had finally resolved. Lawrence told me afterward that this had required the Quorum to bring in an administrative specialist from another sector, which he seemed to find genuinely amusing, and the protocol required a face-to-face assessment before they could close the case or escalate it. Freddie was as he always was, precise, efficient, without cruelty or warmth. He asked me, through the colony's translation system, why I continued to mark surfaces despite the regulatory prohibition. I told him I would keep doing it until I died. He asked me why. I thought about what Elia had said in the cell, about the 3rd cycle, about what they didn't understand. I said, because the walls are ours. This colony is ours. We built it. We lived in it before you arrived and will live in it after you leave. The marks on the walls are how we know that. They're how we remember. And if you take them away, if you keep taking them away, we'll keep putting them back. Not because we've decided to resist you politically, because it's what we are. We can't stop any more than we can stop breathing. And if you could make us stop, if you actually succeeded, then whatever you'd be administering wouldn't be a human colony anymore. You'd have removed the thing that makes it one. The translation system rendered this in Quorum language. Freddy processed it. He ran his instruments. He ran them again. He asked me one more question. What is the function of the image of the bird? I said, it's a bird that doesn't exist here anymore. We draw it because it's gone, because we want to remember it, because we want whoever sees it to feel something about the fact that it's gone. He processed this for a long moment. His instruments registered. I could see the indicator light on his assessment unit, a third cycle. Then he closed the assessment and released me. I don't know what he filed it as. I don't know what category a Quorum administrator uses for something that cannot be filed. But I know that 6 months later the first formal inquiry from the Quorum's central administration reached the Bureau, requesting a comprehensive review of the colony's artistic expression regulatory framework. And I know that a year after that, the review concluded that the current framework was generating unsustainable administrative load and recommended a revised approach. And I know that the revised approach included, among other provisions, a designation of certain colony surfaces as unregulated expression zones, where substrate integrity monitoring would be maintained but surface modification would not be prohibited. They didn't give us the walls because they understood us. They gave us the walls because they couldn't afford not to, because the administrative cost of trying to keep the walls clean had exceeded, in their calculus, the cost of letting them be marked, because we had made the alternative more expensive than they could sustain. That's how it ended, not in fire, not with a last stand or a battle or a moment of pure human triumph to hold up and point to. It ended with a bureaucratic revision, and Lawrence read it to me from the official bulletin in the tone of a man who is very carefully not laughing. That evening I went to the residential block wall, the one Elia and I had worked on over 11 nights, the one that grew louder as you moved right, the one the assessment teams had run 7 cycles on. It had been covered 4 times and marked 4 times and covered again. At that moment it was covered, white administrative sealant, fresh, smooth, and blank. I stood in front of it for a while. Then I took out my father's brushes. I had acquired medium by then, legitimately, which was a word that had recently acquired a new and slightly absurd meaning, and I mixed the colors the way he had taught me, or the way I imagined he would have taught me if he'd had the time, and I started at the left end of the wall. Elia came an hour later. She didn't say anything. She assessed the work I had going, picked up her own brush, and started in. We worked until the artificial morning came up gold and warm, and the sector began to fill with the sounds of the colony waking. And what we made was the loudest, most deliberate, most fully realized piece either of us had ever put on any wall, the work of 2 people who had been given, finally, the time to do it right. In the lower right corner, almost too small to see unless you were looking for it, Elia put the bird. Not white on gray this time, not barely visible, every color we had. I went to find Lawrence, and I brought him back to look at it. He stood in front of it for a long time. I watched his face do the thing it rarely did. He put his hand on my shoulder. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Our father would have understood. There are people who will tell you that what happened in Sector 9 was a political victory, an act of organized resistance that succeeded through strategy and coordination. And that's true enough. Lawrence's bureaucratic work was brilliant. Aaron's logistics were impeccable. The 41 people who went out that night were brave in a way that I've never stopped being grateful for. But I've thought about it for a long time now, and what I believe, what the evidence of all of it points to, is that the Quorum lost not because we outmaneuvered them, though we did, and not because we outlasted them, though we were willing to. They lost because they arrived in our colony expecting to administer a resource system and found instead a species that paints birds on walls, birds that don't exist anymore, birds that serve no function, birds that we draw because we need to, because the need is in us at the level of the blood, because we cannot be in a place without marking that we were there, And the mark is the argument. And the argument is the thing they had no instrument for. They couldn't file it. 7 cycles and they couldn't file it. I think about that sometimes when I'm working a wall in the early morning, when the light is just starting to come up and the color is going on and the image is taking shape. The way a thing becomes itself, section by section, mark by mark, until it's the loudest thing in the room and you step back and look at it and it's yours, entirely yours, nothing like anything that was there before. You cannot administer that out of a person. You cannot regulate it into silence. You cannot run enough cycles on it to make it fit a category. It is what we are. It is what we will still be, every one of us, long after every smooth gray wall in the galaxy has been told what we think of it. My father put his brushes on the table and faded because the world had been made too gray for a man like him. I kept the brushes. That's all it took. Sector 9 has changed. Not in the way that makes for a clean story, not rebuilt, not restored, not returned to some prior state that I'm old enough to romanticize. Change the way places change when the people in them have been through something and come out the other side still standing. The walls are marked now, openly in the light, without curfew and without the particular tightness in the chest that used to come every time you uncapped a can in the dark. Children mark the walls. Old men mark the walls. People who never went out in those years, who kept their heads down and their hands clean and their records clear, they mark the walls now too, and I don't hold it against them. The walls belong to everyone. That was always the argument. Aaron is still here. His wrist never fully healed from the restraint tag. There's a tremor in it when the temperature drops, which in a regulated atmospheric system is either never or always depending on how the calibration is running. He paints with it anyway. He paints birds mostly. He says he's building a record that when the birds come back, if they come back, when the atmospheric regulators are finally brought into a range that can support avian respiration, he wants there to be evidence of what they looked like. So nobody forgets. So the memory survives the gap between when they disappeared and when they return. Lawrence got a commendation from the colony authority for his administrative work during what they officially call the expression rights normalization period. He accepted it with the face of a man who finds the language of official commendations genuinely funny, but is too professional to say so. He has the certificate in his quarters. He uses it as a tray for the things he empties out of his pockets when he comes home. Elia is here. She is sitting, as I write this, at the long table by the window that looks out onto the residential block wall, the one we keep coming back to, and she is working on something that I have not yet seen finished, something she says she has been planning since the night in the cell. She works slowly when she has time and space to work slowly, which she does now. And the image is taking the shape of something I can't yet resolve, something that my eye keeps trying to categorize and keeps failing to because she is still building it. I asked her this morning what it's going to be. She said loud. I told her the wall was already loud. She said louder then. I told her there was a limit to how loud a wall could be. She looked at me over her shoulder, and she had the particular expression she gets when she has already thought of the answer and is waiting for me to catch up. No, she said, there isn't. She turned back to the wall. I let her work. The light was good. The color was going on. The image was becoming itself, mark by mark, and the morning was quiet and the sector was awake and the walls were covered in everything we had ever needed to say. And I sat there with my father's brushes in my hands, and I let her work. Some arguments don't end. That's the thing about them. Some arguments you just keep making, wall by wall, morning by morning, for as long as you're alive to make them. That's all it is. That's everything. I've been asked to write it down, the full account, from the first night at the furnace wall to the assessment office to the residential block at dawn. Because there are people on other stations, other colonies, who are in years that look like our early years and they want to know how it worked. They want the tactical account, the bureaucratic loop, the maintenance work orders, the sensor bracket, the 41 surfaces in one night. All of that is in other documents, written by people who are better than I am at that kind of accounting. What I can give them is this. You have to understand what kind of thing you are before you can use it. I mean that in the specific and literal sense. The quorum was powerful in the ways that power is usually calculated in force, in administrative reach, in technological superiority, in sheer scale. They had more than us in every category that could be measured. But there was one category that couldn't be measured: the hunger, the need to mark. The refusal to be in a place without saying something about it, to be alive without insisting on the fact, to be suppressed without finding some surface, any surface, even a smooth gray detention cell wall with a dry brush and nothing on it, and making it mean something. That isn't a strategy. You can't decide to have it. It's already in you. It was in us before the quorum arrived, and it was in us through every covered wall and every reassignment order and every 7-cycle assessment. And the quorum could not find it on their instruments because their instruments were looking for something that had a function, something that could be filed, and the hunger doesn't have a function. It is the function. It is the thing that runs under everything else. I am not a military man. I was never a soldier. I am a person who puts color on walls in the early morning when the light is good, and who learned in a particular hard stretch of years that this specific, modest, useless, undeniable human habit is exactly the kind of thing that an administrative species cannot sustain a campaign against. Not forever. Not if the people doing it don't stop. We didn't stop. That's the account. The night my father set his brushes on the table and sat down for the last time, I was 12 years old and I didn't know what I was looking at. I thought he was tired. I thought he needed rest. I didn't know that a man can run out of reasons to keep going, that the reasons aren't abstract, that they're as physical as food and water, and that when the world takes the color out of everything a person like my father looked at, it takes something essential from him, something the body needs to keep its own machinery running. I know that now. I've known it for a long time. The brushes are on the table in front of me as I write this. They're worn. The bristles on the larger one have been reset twice now, not the original bristles, which are long gone, but the same brush, the same handle, the same weight in the hand. A thing can be repaired and still be the same thing. A colony can be covered in gray and then covered in color, and then covered in gray again, and then covered in color again, and still be the same colony, still be ours, still carry in its walls the argument that we never stopped making. He should have been here for the morning when the sealant came down, and we went out in the light. He should have been here for Aaron's birds and Lawrence's commendation, and Elia's wall in progress. That is going to be the loudest thing I have ever seen when it is finally done. He wasn't. But the brushes are. And I kept them. And that's enough. It has to be enough. It is what I have. And tomorrow morning, when the light comes up good and gold the way it does now, warm, the way it was never warm in the bad years, the way Elia said it would be when she first described to me what she was planning for the residential wall, how the colors would read differently in real morning light than in the regulated white of curfew lamps. Tomorrow morning I'll take the brushes out and I'll sit down next to her and I'll work on whatever she's building, and the argument will continue. And the walls will be loud, and Sector 9 will be ours. It always was. We just had to remind them. There's something I haven't said yet. Something that I've held back, not because it's the most dramatic part of the account, but because it's the part that I find most difficult to say without it sounding like a thing you say at the end of a speech. But it's true, so I'll say it. In the weeks after the expression rights order came through, when the colony was still adjusting to the reality of open walls, and the Quorum's assessment teams were quietly being reassigned, and the Bureau was revising its procedural framework under Lawrence's careful guidance, Aaron organized a gathering. Not a celebration, because Aaron had the sensibilities of an engineer, and engineers don't celebrate, they debrief. He called it a review. He called it that in official language on the posted notice, and the posted notice was itself a joke in the new vocabulary of the sector, because he had put it up on the residential block wall, our wall, in large hand-lettered text, surrounded by a border of small birds that he had spent an entire evening drawing. And the letter style he used was the same one my father had used on the colony's public surfaces 30 years before, which Aaron had known my father well enough to remember. I stood in front of that notice for a long time. He had used the right letter forms. He had gotten the weight of the lines correct, the particular way the strokes widened and narrowed, the specific rhythm that was as individual as a voice. He had done it from memory, across 30 years. He had been holding it the whole time. That's what I mean when I say it's in us. It's not a decision. It's not a strategy or a posture or a political commitment. It's the fact that a 70-year-old engineer who spent 12 years watching patrol units and memorizing sensor rotation schedules was, the entire time, also holding the exact weight and rhythm of a dead man's letter forms, waiting for a wall he was allowed to put them on. The Quorum assessed our walls and found molecular instability. What they found was us. Every species that has ever tried to administer human beings has eventually encountered the same wall, in the metaphorical sense, the point at which the administrative model runs into the thing it can't measure, can't file, can't regulate into silence. Some of them learn from it. Most of them don't, because learning from it would require understanding it, and understanding it would require having something in them that is like it, and they don't. We do. That's all it is. That's everything. The morning after Aaron's gathering, I went out before the sector woke, and I stood at the residential block wall, alone, early, the artificial morning cycle just warming up towards something that was trying to remember what gold felt like. And I looked at what Elia and I had built across 40 meters of surface over the years since the first time we worked it together. It was loud. She had been right about that. I put my hand flat against the wall. The alloy was warm from the heat cycling. The paint was dry and slightly rough under my palm, the texture of layered pigment, many nights of work. I left my hand there for a moment. Then I picked up a brush, and I started where I left off. The wall was loud. We made it louder. That's what you do. That's what we are. Let me account for the people who didn't make it. I've left them at the edges of this story, unnamed, present mostly as context, and that's not entirely fair. There were 7 people from the original 41 who were detained in the sweep that followed the coordinated night. 5 of them were processed through the standard track, assessment, labor reassignment, the outer maintenance sectors. 2 of them died there. Respiratory. The timeline was faster than the Bureau's statistics suggested it would be, which is the kind of thing that happens when statistics are compiled by the administering party rather than the administered. I don't remember them the way I remember Aaron and Elia and Lawrence, because I didn't know them as well, and I'm not going to invent intimacy with them to make this account feel more complete. What I can tell you is their names. Tonio was 43 years old. He had worked the outer ring maintenance crew before the occupation reorganized the labor assignments, and he had known my father in the years when the walls were still open, and he told me once that my father had drawn a mural on the outer ring junction wall in the year before I was born that had stayed up for 6 months before the regulation came through, and that it had been the size of the junction wall and the color of a late sunset, and that people had stood in front of it and been unable to say why they felt what they felt. I never saw it. He described it to me once, and I built it in my head from the description, and I've kept it there. It's the most vivid image I don't have. Olga was 29. She had come from the same outer habitat ring as Elia, though they hadn't known each other there. She worked in the filtration system. She had a particular style, very fine lines, extremely patient, the kind of detailing that takes hours to get right and reads from a distance as almost photographic in its precision. Her images were always small. She said she preferred working in the scale where you had to get close to see it, where seeing it was a choice you had to make, where the image was a thing the viewer found rather than a thing that announced itself. She found her own way of saying we were here. It was a quiet way. It was hers. I put their names here because they belong here in the account, alongside the maintenance work orders and the bureaucratic loops and the sensor brackets and the 41 surfaces and all the rest of it. They're not a footnote. They're part of what happened. The story doesn't work without them. The story doesn't work without any of the people who went out into the dark and made a mark on a wall because they needed to and because they refused not to. And some of them are here to tell you about it, and some of them aren't. And the ones who aren't are still on the walls, in the way that people who mattered are still in the places where they put their hands. The colony is ours. It always was. We just had to keep saying it. I think about Freddie sometimes. I know that's an odd thing to say, that I think about a quorum administrator, that I spend time considering the inner workings of a species that spent 17 years running assessments on us and could not file a single image. But I do. I think about the third cycle. I think about what it must be like to have instruments that account for everything you have ever encountered, everything in the range of what you know a thing can be, and then to point those instruments at a wall covered in color and run the third cycle and come up empty. Not because the instruments are broken, because the thing on the wall is outside the range. I think he knew by the end. Not understood. I don't think the quorum's cognition had the architecture for understanding it, the same way a species that communicates in pure data doesn't have the architecture for knowing what it's like to press a dry brush against a wall and trace the shape of something that isn't there. But I think he knew that there was something there he couldn't reach. I think the third cycle was him trying to reach it. I don't hold anything against Freddie. He was an administrator who encountered something outside his administrative model and handled it the only way his model allowed. He ran the cycle again. He ran it a third time. And then he sat in his office across from a 22-year-old with paint residue on his hands and the brushes of a dead man in his pack. And he asked what the bird meant. And I told him. And something in the space between the answer and his instruments registered as anomaly, as a thing that cannot be filed, as a third cycle finding nothing and running anyway. That's as close as it gets, I think. That's the closest you can come to crossing the gap when you don't have the architecture for it. You keep running the cycle. You stay at the wall. You hold the instruments against the surface until the session ends. It's not understanding, but it's attention. And attention is somewhere to start. I don't know where the quorum went after Sector 9. I know the broader administrative reorganization that followed the expression rights normalization spread to other sectors, other colonies, other stations where the same thing had been happening at a smaller scale for years. I know from people who arrived in Sector 9 from those other places that the pattern was consistent. The walls spoke. The assessment teams ran their cycles. The cycles generated anomalous readings. The administrative load accumulated until it wasn't sustainable. And eventually someone in the quorum's hierarchy concluded that a revised framework was indicated. They were never going to understand it. They just had to decide it wasn't worth the cost. And it kept not being worth the cost because we kept painting. We kept drawing birds that didn't exist anymore and letters in the style of people who were gone and images that had no function and color that the instruments couldn't categorize. We kept doing it the way we breathe, without deciding to, because it's not a decision, it's a metabolism. You cannot regulate a metabolism. You can make it harder. You can make it dangerous. You can create conditions in which the cost of breathing the wrong way is severe enough that some people stop. Some people will always stop. There is no shame in it. Survival is its own argument, and Lawrence understood that better than most. But some people won't stop. There will always be someone who packs 3 cans under a floor panel and goes out after curfew. There will always be someone who carries a dry brush into a detention cell and presses it against a smooth gray wall and traces the outline of something that isn't there. There will always be the hunger. The Quorum ran their instruments against it for 17 years and never got a clean reading. The colony is loud now. It's going to stay loud. I'm going to make sure of it.